So a couple of things to think about here. The United States are born at this moment, right? The United States is a commitment of these formerly separate colonies to bind together. We're binding together because that's the only way we're going to get free from Great Britain, who is misusing us through their policies. Big questions remain, however. How are these 13 independent states, well, now states because they've all declared their independence, how are they going to form a united government between them? Because they're not really sure what that's going to look like yet. But the British policies have driven us together. What we're going to make of it remains to be seen. And there'll be lots of upheaval over what it means to be in a union together over the next several centuries. The reason they look nervous is because Great Britain is about to unload on the American colonies. The reason that South Carolina was so nervous is because they're way down at the bottom. At least the New England have several cities together where they might combine in some naval force. South Carolina's hanging down there at the bottom. They got the Caribbean right below them. They really feel very vulnerable because the British are coming after them. Right? They're not. By the way, would the British even, what do they think about this assembly of men? The United States, the Continental Congress, what's that? Right? They think that that's just some illegitimate meeting of some people who are saying that they've got some kind of authority, but the British are saying, you have no authority. You guys are just some people that are up in arms and you're trying to make yourself look legitimate, but you're not legitimate. But they have taken every step possible to try to establish legitimacy and suggest that they've gotten these different colonies have all sent representatives and they've made something binding upon themselves. So now the next, I like this image, they begin to pull down the statues of King George and other monarchs. It kind of looks like, I guess, at the end of the Star Wars series when they're pulling down the Emperor and such, right? Or pulling down Saddam Hussein after the Iraq War in 2003, pulling down the dictator's pictures. All right, and we can go on now and finish the war. All right, this is General Gage, who is sent to occupy Massachusetts. He's actually in Boston when down in Philadelphia, the Americans have chosen to declare their independence. This is George Washington at the time that he gets the command of the Continental Army. We're now going to have a fight between the British military and what we can make of an American military. He's going to be replaced by Clinton later on. How long does this war last? We all know about it coming into class. Is it pretty quick? Is it pretty easy? Does it take very long? Have y'all follow Syria a little bit? They've been in a civil war for now 2 years. They've had about 200,000 civilian deaths so far. Got a couple million refugees who've left. They're 2 years into it. How long will it take them to get what they want? They're in difficult circumstances. Do you know how long it takes us to get what we want? We declare independence in 1776. I guess you could look at your IDs and figure out the date. What would conclude that war? 1783. The 1783 Treaty of Paris is when they finally sit down and sign a document with us. Most of the fighting is over by 1781. But for 5 years, we struggle. And if you want to know how it goes, the first 2 years are horrible. We're in real trouble. We've got hardly any military. We've got very little coordination of the different states. George Washington's got a lot of heart and fantastic moral courage, but he's not much of an officer of a land army against one of the greatest militaries out there. The greatest land army would be Prussia. But probably right behind that would be British troops. They are an imperial, excellent military, and they're going to be up against a civilian population that's trying to operate on the battlefield in these large engagements. Here's a couple of primary source quotes that I got for you. I think it's kind of interesting to set it. Here's what this one columnist wrote. We have no resources. Our army is in shambles. We have little hope of help from foreign powers. And now we are faced with the prodigious powers and resources of our enemy. In spite of all this, they signed the bravery of those delegates in Philadelphia, right? They're really going to go for it despite the fact that they seem to be a fool's errand. This is the position of the British. Admiral Howe's secretary. We've heard the Continental Congress has announced that the colonies are to be independent states. The madness of these deluded people. What are they thinking? They can't, there's no way they can pull this off. This has to do with the problem of the different colonies. They don't know each other that well. Here's a boy from Connecticut who's volunteered. They put me in this regiment, half New Englanders and half Pennsylvanians. Folks as different as night and day. Myself, I'd rather be fighting with the tribe of Indians than with these Southerners. By the way, who do they call the Southerners? People from where? Pennsylvania. Do you think Pennsylvanians are Southerners? Not so much, right? So he says they call me that damn Yankee. What does he say about them? They're foreigners, can hardly speak English, right? Probably Dutch Pennsylvanian. They don't like me either. They call me that damn Yankee, right? So there's not a deep organization or even knowledge of each other to form these combined effort. I like this one down here. George Washington. This is the great thing about George Washington. He's going to stay in the field and he's going to keep his troops up despite overwhelming odds. Here's one of his addresses after one of his early defeats. Remember, soldiers, you're free men fighting for the blessings of liberty. Remember that you and your descendants will become slaves if you don't acquit yourselves like men. Remember Boston and Charleston. The enemy discovered at great cost what a few brave men fighting for their own land for the best of causes can do against soldiers for hire. He is taking on the mantle of a Greek. He knows his history. He knows the significance. Militia DS. I'm going to give you this name real quick. It's not an ID for you because it's so far back. It's a Greek leader in about 350 BC. The Athenians are facing an invasion from what empire? Y'all remember from watching 300? Or that second installment? The Persians, right? The Persians are coming over after them. And here Athens is by itself. This has to do with the Battle of Marathon. An Athenian army made up of citizens goes out to the battlefield to face this huge imperial army coming up on the coast. And they're watching them get off their ships. And they are outnumbered about 5-1. And Militia DS is the name of the commander, and he rallies his troops and says, guess what, the people behind you, your families, you don't want to live this day if you don't win. So throw everything you've got into this, because your families behind you will literally become slaves. They'll be sold, all your possessions, so go out and fight and leave it all on the battlefield. And he decides to go ahead and attack first and not wait for the Persians to get organized. And so Militia DS is this idea that how do you take independent soldiers, citizens, and make soldiers out of them? What do you think we get from this man's name? Militia, right? The militia idea is the idea that it's a citizens' army who are willing to come out and fight. And that's really what Washington has. The only thing going for this army is their spirit and their willingness, and they're going to have setback after setback. On the other hand, here's his letter to the Continental Congress. He's got a problem on his hands. He's getting no resources to fight this war. You can't expect to get good soldiers to defend our inalienable rights when fighting for them will bankrupt themselves and their family. They need some pay for the soldiers so they can send some money back to their families. They've got to have provisions. And the states don't end up coordinating their actions very well. All right. They've already got control of Boston, although they're facing some skirmishes up there. But now the British invade New York City in August 1776. They land 30,000 troops. Some of them, I mean, a whole flotilla coming over. Huge, huge invasion coming into America. And George Washington's got 12,000 troops, and they're not very well trained. And the British start marching into the city. Washington has a series of battles, and he has a series of defeats. He has the Battle of Harlem. He has the Battle of White Plains. He has the Battle of the Bronx, I do believe, too. He is continually run out of town. His troops can't take on the British Imperial Army. Okay, so that's what I want you to know this early phase. Let's see what IDs I have. I think I'll go ahead and bring up the word Loyalists now. Loyalists is an ID for you. They're the opposite of the Patriots. We've got the Patriots and the Loyalists. Patriots are Americans who strongly favor independence. Loyalists are people who disagree that America should leave this relationship. They tend to be English ethnicity. They tend to be people who came from England, old stock England people, now, as opposed to the Pennsylvania Dutch or the Huguenots or the Scots-Irish who've come over. They tend to be involved with the Church of England because the Church of England has the king as the head of the church. They're pretty conservative and pretty traditional. And then we've got this middle section of people who have, I guess, I don't think you have truly a lot of neutral people. But here's what I want you to know. At the beginning of the war, there's quite a few loyalists who are irritated at what's happening. I think something like 40,000, I need to double check my numbers, I don't have my file with me. Something like 40,000 Americans leave America after the Independence War because they were identified as supporters of the crown and we wanted them to leave. And many of them have to go back to England, right, where they're accepted as returning people that don't really know England that well. But here's what I want you to know. What the British now do when they begin to occupy places like New York City, when Washington pulls out and the troops come in, what are the troops asking themselves about the civilians? What do they wonder about the civilians in New York City? What's the question they ask themselves? Is he a loyalist or a patriot, right? Is this one of the rebels? Has this person been supporting them? And here's what ends up happening. The British military ends up not being very disciplined. And they do a lot of looting. You know what looting is? Looting is when you just steal things, you break into shops, they loot homes, they look for, they try to figure out who a rebel is, and if they can say you're a rebel, then they can go to your house and take everything. This is a strong, long tradition of military looking for a little extra pay, so to speak. The fact that the British don't treat the civilian population very well is going to cause grievances among other Americans. And so here's one more thing. The British are going to lose the appeal that they have as they punish civilians. You know, when we're abroad and we're occupying, let's say in Afghanistan or Iraq, we come in saying we're getting rid of this bad leadership. We're getting rid of the Taliban in Afghanistan, or we're getting rid of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. But we can get friction begin to build up, right? They need to see us as a group that's coming in to liberate them and somebody who respects them. What happens if we start abusing the people who live there or taking advantage of them? Do they like us? They don't. They get very upset at us when they see these pictures of us urinating on their dead soldiers' bodies, right? If y'all may remember that from Iraq. This is the same thing, and this begs the question, why didn't we control our troops better in Iraq in the early period, some of them in 2003, 2004? Because we know from experience that when the British abused our civilian population, that tipped the tide of more Americans siding with the British, and we're just so angry now we don't care if we live or die, we're going to make sure we try to kill this group. Alright, here's your ID Trenton, and it was on your pre-test. Washington gets run out of New York by October, and he crosses over the Delaware River and goes into Pennsylvania in late October, early November. He's been run out of everywhere, and he's camped out. The reason he's gone across the Delaware River is because that would be a pretty good-sized river to stop the British from chasing his army and catching him. The British stop on the other side of the Delaware River, and they pull their troops back, and they just leave a little garrison guard on the other side of the river there from where they think Washington couple thousand army is. And they're not worried about it because winter's coming, and they're going to just wait and to see what happens the next year, and they think the Americans will give up pretty soon. Now, Washington's got a problem on his hands. What do you think all the colonies are thinking about what they've done so far? Since he's gotten beaten at every turn, and New York City has been looted, and civilians have been killed, and the Continental Congress has no way to provide security. What do you think they think about him? What do they think about the decision the delegates made? You think they're having reconsideration? They are. All the colonies are thinking, what are we doing here? So what does he need? He needs what? Rally them? And he also so he needs something. He needs a win. He needs a victory. And so he puts it all on the line. What's this picture? What's this famous picture? Do y'all know it? I bet, come on, someone tell me what it is.
It's crossing Christmas time.
Yeah, and what's the river? Washington crossing the... Y'all know it? No, you don't know it. Sad state of affairs. Washington crossing the Delaware. It's this famous moment. Now, in American history, this becomes a bit of a myth, a little bit. Well, for one thing, it was said that Washington could throw a rock across the river. He was this great, valiant man. But I will give you this. It is a gutsy move he makes, because he gets his troops, he gets them on ships, and he's going to go across. By the way, it's Christmas Eve, as he mentioned. They get on these boats, and they go across the river. It's Christmas Eve, and on the other side of the river are some German mercenaries that the British have hired. And these German mercenaries, it's Christmas Eve. They're half drunk and they're singing, you know, Silent Night in German. When up from the water comes these American soldiers, and they fall on them. And they don't annihilate them, but they kill a whole bunch of German soldiers who then flee. And then George Washington marches on to this little place, Trenton, New Jersey, where he briefly, I'm getting a little nervous here, he briefly occupies Trenton. Well, the British then send troops to go retake that, because they were like back consolidating things in this other part of the New England. So what does he do at that point in time? I need to have it where I can flip this thing. He abandons Trenton, comes back across the water to safety. It was a hit and run tactic. But what is it? It gives talking points to all the colonists. You think this is going to be run in the papers in South Carolina and everywhere else? George Washington takes Trenton. But in small print the next day. And leaves Trenton, right? The next day. But we need a win. And he knows it. That's part of the leader. That's part of the great qualities of him. His determination. He knows he's going to make the history books. He's either Militia DS, the modern Militia DS, or he's this dude who tried to do something that never happened, and he doesn't make the history books very well. That's the great thing about him. We need help, by the way. We really need help to pull this thing off. Do we get help? Do we ultimately get help? Who do we get? Robert? Who?
I can't pronounce the last name.
Von Steuben? He's going to come in, yes. He's going to help our military. He's going to help Washington train our troops. What else do we do? Who else do we get help from? Anybody know?
No, we get aid from Spain.
Barely. We have a much more important ally. France. Do y'all know this? France ends up being our ally. But by the way, the French, this is Benjamin Franklin also. In the midst of all this, we put Benjamin Franklin on a ship, and we need him to try to get the French to come into a treaty with us. And it takes him over a year to get this thing. Does the French government just simply want to jump in and help the Americans? Yeah, they're going to go, I thought we just fought you guys, right? At Quebec and Montreal, and I think your kinsfolk were there driving us out of North America. Why should we now come fight with you? Franklin says, so you can have Quebec back. And Montreal if you want it. But the French are like, you know how much money we racked up in the 7 Years' War? We're in real trouble here, and they are in real trouble. And that financial trouble is going to lead to them having a French Revolution within 5 years. So, Franklin's got a hard thing. The French say, you show us that you're willing to fight and can make it, and can do something, and then we'll re-talk about it. Now, your ID here, this young man on the left here, actually quite younger than what I think that picture looks like. But his name is Gilbert de Lafayette. That's his real name, but he is known as the Marquis de Lafayette. He is a French aristocrat with democratic/republican ideals. He comes to America to volunteer in this great effort on behalf of humanity. He must not be happy with the system of government in France, which has an absolutist monarch. It's interesting because he's part of the aristocracy. But you know, during the Enlightenment, which is very much centered in France, many people are criticizing this absolutist form of government, and they're wanting more liberty. So he comes here. Do we ever see people leaving their home and going to fight for a cause that they want to identify themselves with today? Can you think of any where that takes place today? Where people live and they say, wow, there's a war going on somewhere and I want to go over there and fight in that war. because I believe in the principles of the people fighting. You seen that? What is it? You know what I'm getting at? How about the Jihadis? The Muslim Jihadis who go to Syria to fight against Assad. How about the ones that say, yeah, I'm leaving and I'm going. Now, I don't want to equate him with the idea that he's like, has the principles of jihadi, which is anti-democratic, anti-republican, but he is coming, he's being drawn to this cause. Just like now some people go to other causes and fight. Now, what's significance about him? He's French. He begins to write home to France and saying, more of us should come over. He's got some friends who come with him. He shows up in Philadelphia and he finds George Washington right before they have to evacuate Philadelphia. And he's like, I'm here to help. And Washington's like, fantastic. What can you do? I got a horse with me and I can, you know. So he gets put in a cavalry unit. But what he really does is he helps inspire a lot of the Americans that maybe help is coming. They need help in money, and they need guns, and they need finances to feed themselves. Battle of Saratoga. You know, really significant victory. We have the first victory of an American army against a British army. British army coming down from Canada. An American army coming out of New England goes to fight a British army coming down from Canada, and we win that battle. That is the Battle of Saratoga, October 1777. That information gets to Franklin. By the way, it was not Washington's victory. It was another commander who did this. Benjamin Franklin is able to use the battle to convince the French that we can do this and we're serious. And that leads to the conclusion of a treaty with France in February 1778. That's going to be good news when it comes. The French wanted to stay out of it for a while. They did not want to get into another war with Britain if we weren't going to be able to be successful. And we needed to show that we had the will to do this, we were willing to take casualties, and that we could get our act together enough to defeat British armies. Once we've done that, they formally enter an alliance. They don't want to come in by themselves, because they bring Portugal in with them and they bring Spain in with them. Now we're all in an alliance, and by the way, we all say we're all at war with Britain, and none of us will make a peace treaty with Britain unless we all agree to it. That becomes problematic later on, but at least we've got the French on our side. They now begin to send us troops and weapons and money. But before that gets here, we have a really hard time. Have y'all heard of Valley Forge? Anybody get Valley Forge growing up? Valley Forge is this place in Pennsylvania where Washington has to hunker down during the second winter of the war. The winter of 1770-78 is the nadir, or the low point, in the war for Washington. His army has not been successful. Yes, they had that victory up at Saratoga, but that was only one. He's got a ragtag group of people who are following just because they're committed to Washington, kind of like later on when some Southerners will stay with General Lee because they're absolutely committed to the man. Washington's got, they're practically starving to death in Pennsylvania. Congress is not sending him the money he needs. They don't have the supplies. They've got snow everywhere. They're freezing. Disease, I guess the flu breaks out in the camp. They lose a lot of people to death. And they're all thinking, gee whiz, how's this going to work out? When somebody arrives with a German accent. This guy's name is Frederick William von Steuben. He's Prussian-German. You remember me talking about Prussia before in this class? What was significant about the Prussians? Best military in the world, best structure, knew how to form an officer corps, knew how to drill. They could take average German farmers and make them into soldiers. These are these depictions which we later have of him showing up at this little camp that Washington has. He's another volunteer who believes in this, what the Americans are trying to do. By the way, he's going to be fighting against other German soldiers who are mercenaries hired by the British. But he's come here because he believes in the principles of Republican form of government. Beginning in the spring and summer, he begins to take over the drilling of the citizens' army, and he begins to make them more into soldiers. That's going to be significant. With the arrival of von Steuben, Washington's military becomes more professional over the next couple of years. We're getting help, and we needed it. The British finally give up on the idea that they can succeed in New England and in the northern states. Part of it's their fault. They had a loyalist group that they could have worked with, but the activities of the army against the civilians inflamed the opinions of the Americans so that more and more of them thought we're never going to live with these people. The British are trying to beat us to stay in the marriage. Does that work usually? I mean, it can, but ultimately, it's not a good idea. The Americans aren't feeling the love here. And so eventually they abandoned Philadelphia. Now you've got all these people who said that when the British were there that they were loyalists, but now all of a sudden the British have left Philadelphia. And so when the Patriots come back in, they're like, I heard you were a loyalist and you were helping out with the British, and so now you're in trouble. So civilians increasingly begin to think that the British are capricious, that they change their minds about things, they don't really care about the loyalists anyway, and so what's the point of even supporting them? But ultimately the British give up on this, they pull back their troops, and they go with phase 3 of the battle, which is to do what? Where's their next campaign? They come south, they take Charleston, and then they start, and they're thinking they can get, that there's loyalists there, that they might form an army and at least hold on to the southern parts. Okay, I've got one more ID for you here. And it is the Battle of Cowpens. There's also Guilford Courthouse, and there's also the Battle of Kings Mountain. Anybody know where these are? Anybody from Carolina? North Carolina in here? These are all in North Carolina near Charlotte. You know, Charlotte's really quite far south in North Carolina. It's almost to South Carolina. What the British do, after they have consolidated Charleston and they're marching around in South Carolina, they decide to bring the battle up into North Carolina. But what happens is Scots-Irish come out of the Appalachian Mountains. What is current day? By the way, what is this state today right here? Yeah, that's Tennessee, right? It was part of North Carolina at that point in time. They come down. They're called the Over-the-Mountain Men. You heard of the Over-the-Mountain Men or the Over-the-Mountain Trail? They go up through Bristol, Tennessee. They go up Roan Mountain. They come down on the other side. They come down into Carolina, go by Grandfather Mountain. It's a really pretty, nice track. But they didn't have to get involved in this war, did they? They really didn't. They could have stayed far, far from it. But they don't like their British king anyway. They don't like the fact that the British troops are in the area and that the southern colonies might end up having to stay within the British Empire. And so they're like, we're going to leave now and go fight this battle. And so at Cowpens, they help defeat a British regiment there. Anybody see the movie The Patriot? Right? This is all about that southern campaign. That's another Mel Gibson movie from the period. So the significance here is these battles, and now having not succeeded here, the new commander is General Cornwallis. Yes, Haley?
Did you say Over the Mountain Men?
Over the Mountain Men is what they're known as. Yorktown is your next ID. We can wrap up the war. We're now into 1781. Cornwallis is the name of the commander who surrenders to George Washington at Yorktown. Yorktown is the final battle of the American Revolutionary War. It takes place in Virginia, not far from Jamestown, that original settlement. There are two main commanders in the South. They're separated from each other. The British group here in the Carolinas starts heading back and thinking about maybe leaving. This other guy, Cornwallis, who's over here more on the coastal area, he starts realizing he can't be successful either, and he wants to leave. George Washington brings down his army from Pennsylvania. Southerners are coming too, and they're basically pushing the British all towards the Virginia Peninsula. There's French troops involved. There's American troops who are now highly professionalized. Von Steuben and the Marquis de Lafayette are among Washington's main group of council. And they trap, here's the last thing I'd like you to know about an important feature of this, is that the French do something really important for us. They agree to bring their navy from the Caribbean. They had a few islands left in the Caribbean. They had Haiti and they had another one. And they brought their navy and they blockaded the Chesapeake Bay, keeping British transports from being able to make it in and rescue Cornwallis and take off with his army. And that was a very significant thing that the French did for us, because it allowed us to have a showdown with Cornwallis. We've got him outnumbered, and he's looking out there, and we're getting closer and closer to his lines. We've got these men moving up on him over several days, and finally Cornwallis simply surrenders his army. And so Cornwallis and the British are allowed to leave, but they've been defeated. So that's that last big thing. Now for the next 2 years, we don't get a final agreement for the divorce, but we finally get it in 1783 with that very last ID for you, the Treaty of Paris, 1783. One of the problems, I will say this about that treaty, we're ready to have a treaty with them. But the problem is the French want some things from the British. They would love it if they could get a hold of Montreal and Quebec back, right? But they're pretty strongly positioned there, and those northern colonies did not go up in rebellion and join the Americans. Number two, Spain wants this little rock in the Mediterranean called the Rock of Gibraltar. Have y'all heard of that? The Rock of Gibraltar? Y'all see this map right here? Y'all see the Mediterranean? Look at how little the entrance is on the left. Right there, there's a little sliver to get into the Mediterranean, and there's a rock sitting there. It's called the Rock of Gibraltar. And the British took that from Spain in the 1600s. And the Spanish want it back because it's such an important strategic position because the British have got a pretty big naval base there. So the Spanish don't want to conclude a treaty with the British until they get the Rock of Gibraltar. And the Portuguese want some things too. And we're going, gee whiz, we're done. We've accomplished our war aims. So the problem is we're in an alliance with other ones. And we waited out, but we're getting nervous because the British might think about going to war again with us. They have so far not done it. So Benjamin Franklin, who's in Paris, and he's got some other men with him, including John Adams, they start thinking, because Congress is writing Franklin to get this thing signed before something changes. So finally, this is what I guess you might want to write this down. We privately begin negotiations with the British for a settlement, a divorce settlement. Who gets what? Who gets the Great Lakes? What will be the western boundaries? What will be British territory? And we get it all worked out with them. The Great Lakes will be demilitarized. Canada will remain in the British Empire. The British give up all claims west of the Appalachian Mountains as far as can go. We're pretty well satisfied. This is awesome. It's a good deal. Now we have to tell the French. Benjamin Franklin has to finally let the French know. We're new at this, and my associates have been negotiating with the British, and they're ready to sign this thing. And then the French are kind of irritated at us. And so are the Spanish, but they understand that we really need to get this done. And he says, "Sorry, we're kind of new at this whole diplomacy thing." But obviously, the French come around because look where the treaty is signed, right? It's signed in Paris. So, and the French become a signatory to our future independence, and so we win our independence there in Paris in 1783, and now we get to figure out what we're going to do with ourselves. We have created a United States. Why did we create a United States? Why did we create? Remember, the United States get created at in Philadelphia on July 4th. We, the United States of America, right? So why did we do that? Why did we form it? Why did we come together? We never come together before as colonies. It's pretty obvious, right? British policy and our need to rebel against them. But now what's going to happen to us? How united are we? And that's the big question for what's about to come on. If you turn your page on your ID list, you can imagine what the question now is. What kind of union do we have, and how are we going to make a government for it? How much coordination are we going to have, and how are those states going to relate to each other? And what about all these land claims out here? Will North Carolina simply go all the way out there and be one really long state? So we've got lots of things to work out.